This activity is about determining the impact of the external factors on solution and how we can try and still remove those external factors or external limitations and the internal constraints of the organization to ensure that we still are in a position to realize the potential value that we have identified in the scope of the solution. And that's very, very important. And again, we need to consider all these different factors like culture, operations, technical components, pretty much like the previous one, because we have done that. We've been able to assess those limitations both from the point of view of the technology, the infrastructure, operations, as well as from the external factors, and also within the internal ones in terms of the stakeholder interest, the power that they wield and the reporting structures and all these. And then we'll come up with the right set of actions that would help us to overcome those limitations. So what are the inputs for this recommend actions to increase solution value activity? So we get the solution limitation, we get the enterprise limitation. These are the ones which we gathered, which we've identified and defined in the previous set of activities. Those are going to set as the inputs for us in this context. And then the recommended actions to increase solution value is the sort of task that we do. And for that, we need to be able to refer to the business objectives like before. We need to look at the overall strategic and the organizational level goals, the strategy. And we also need to look at the current state description as well as the future state description, not just current state, because then we will be in a position to say where we are now, what we have got ahead, and how we're going to bridge the gap, both of these. And of course, the solution scope in terms of the proposed solution, where we want to go, what are the approaches that we can take, what are the methods, the techniques, the tools that we're going to implement in the context of that solution scope, and how we can bridge the gap is basically the recommended actions, which is the output. It's like a report or action taken report kind of a thing. ATR is what we call. We can try and give that as an output from this activity, and that could again be useful in the context of how we communicate that to the stakeholders and how we engage them on a continual basis. So this report or the recommended actions could be sent out as a report. We can conduct a workshop. If they're middle management people, we can explain, we can walk them through what we found out with the assessments of the solution limitations and the organizational limitations, and why we think that this set of changes are required, this set of next steps and action points are required for us to bridge the gap. So that's what is the kind of exercise that we engage the stakeholders in, and we can get their buy-in from there. So what do we need to do here as BAs? We need to understand, first of all, we need to look at the gap. We need to understand where the gap is in terms of the proposed solution and what we have found out during the last two activities, i.e. the solution limitation assessment and the organizational limitation assessment. And we find the gap, and then it's about how we can adjust the solution performance with those with a set of measures, with the metrics, and with the using those data points for us to be able to look at how we can improve the performance of the solution. And then what are the recommendations that we can come up from here. So basically there could be several recommendations depending on what you've identified. It could be to do with, for example, the change in the organization, the change in the culture, some of the ways, for example, that the ways of working, you can change the ways of working from a traditional mainstream ways to the agile and more market-facing, client-facing, and the customer-focused approach. You can try and look at how you can cut down the complexity by introducing some simple measures, some ways of working, and techniques and methods which are going to help look at things in a more lucid manner, in a simple manner, and you're trying to actually deploy the tools and techniques in a way that would help your staff, the team members, to address the complexity in a simple way. So, for example, you can have glossaries, you can have some of these procedures and policies pasted as kind of templates or posters in most of the organizations to remind them that we are now going agile. This is the way to go. This is the new way of working. So let's try and adopt these approaches. And eliminate redundancy is very important, because you're trying to you duplicate a lot of different things, and there's a lot of significant resources, your time, effort, and people are going into the redundancy, so you can try and remove that. And sometimes even you've got the solution that has been there for a good 15 years, and the technology is not being supported now. It is not functional. If you want to add a new functionality to this code, for example, which was written 20 years ago in a language called Pro4, it's not helping you. That's a very old language. You're not really getting to the programmers who are comfortable coding in that. You're getting only one or two programmers out of like 50,000 interviews that you've done, or 50,000 job adverts that you placed. So the rate is not that attractive. You're not getting the right resources. Even if you get that one or two persons to implement that change in the functionality, or to add new features into the existing product suite, it's not supported by the Pro4 or these Uniphase or these kind of technologies. So you've got to either move on to a newer platform, or to completely re-engineer the solution. So that's why, in fact, I have worked on similar projects before, where the product was developed about 25, 30 years ago into one of these languages called Pro4 or Uniphase, or sometimes COBOL. And from there, we need to be able to re-engineer the product, create a completely new product called, it's not even migration. That's why we call it as a re-engineering. We need to completely start afresh and create a new product with a newer technology. And that's what we did with a couple of projects, which one was developed in Java, another one was developed in .NET, completely ground up from the start, because the technology that was used to develop this existing product is not relevant anymore. We don't get the resources, we don't get the people to work on, no support from the vendors, no point actually trying to continue that. That's why look at the features, understand what is the feature delivering, try and write up the requirements from the beginning, and then start looking at the architecture, the design, as if it's a new project altogether. But we've got the solution working, so we can refer to that solution time and again. But then we can't keep the same features. We need to add more features. We need to make changes to the features, because things have changed, customers' needs have changed, the way you implement things have changed. So you need to look at those. And sometimes it's also important to realize that you've got all these options plus one important option, which is to do nothing. You want to continue the same set of tools, same set of techniques, same set of working as you're doing now. You don't want to do anything, because that do nothing is a good option to have, instead of actually investing millions of dollars and getting hundreds of people to do something which is not helping your cause, for example. So in that case, do nothing is a significant decision that you might want to take, which is again very important to consider. And to be able to come up with these options, what is important is you need to look at the cost versus benefit. You need to look at the tangible costs, intangible costs. You need to look at the benefits, again, tangible, intangible benefits, goodwill, reputation, IPs, and also the various costs could be the variable costs, the fixed costs, the maintenance costs, and also the cost of even the opportunity cost of not doing something, for example. And then the necessity, you've got to do that, come what may. It's nothing to do with the costs or the savings or anything like that, because you are regulated, you're compelled by the regulatory requirements and the compliance requirements to have to implement that. There's no other go. It's not about the cost. It's not about do you have an option? No, you don't have. You must do that, because that's what your regulator, your the Financial Conduct Authority, or the FDA, Food and Drug Administrator, if it's in the health industry, they say that you must follow that. You've got to have a project like MiFID 2, for example, or even some of the things like Basel 2, Basel 3, or for example, if it's to do with the HL7, HIPAA, they must be done. This is an obligation. This is important. This is mandatory. You must have that. So you should do that. That's a necessity. And then the sunk cost is basically, again, looking at what has been done so far and how much of it has been should be kind of written off, and considering all the aspects that need to be done in that. So again, very, very important. You need to consider all of these costs versus benefits to be able to come up with the recommendations for your proposed solution and the next steps. What are the stakeholders that you would need to work with? Who are the different stakeholders? What are the different kind of bodies and organizations you would need to work with? It could be to do with customers, again, domain SMEs that you've got to consult for some ideas and ways for how you can recommend next steps. End users, again, are a significant source of insights into how you can, and the sponsors would be a good source for you to understand what are the potential budgets, the financial implications, and the regulators. We just talked about one of the cases where the regulators are important. They have a say in terms of how your next steps are going to follow, how your projects are going to be shaped, or driven by the regulatory requirements, not by your whims and fancies, or not by your vision. It's not the organization's vision that drives them. It's the regulators, compliance regulators, mandatory requirements that drive you to comply with them and to implement those changes and recommendations. So what are the techniques that you would need to really deploy in this activity? Data mining, again, very important, because it's your significant set of data that you have got. You would need to mine it to be able to take some decisions, help decide the way forward. That's what we do in the decision analysis. And then the financial analysis is to do with the costs, the benefits, the paybacks, and the discounted cash flows, and the break evens. And the risk analysis would identify all the potential risks involved in those recommendations that you have given. The focus groups would actually give you the idea about the features and the product, the concepts, whether you've got the right aspects of right set of features in the market, how much are they willing to pay. Again, very superficial, very surface level views and preference based inputs. It's not really driven by experience or usage. So you just need to take that with that perspective in mind. Organizational modeling could be one of the ways that you have recommended, because you want to restructure your teams, you want to come up with new ways of working, you want to have a different set of roles and job descriptions that would suit your profiles. And so you would like to do a bit of organizational modeling there. Prioritization in terms of which ones to do first and which ones to do later. Again, Moscow based tools, like for example, Moscow prioritization, Moscow model, like must have, could have, should have, or and then the will not have or must do, could do, all those Moscow typical prioritization modeling tools. ABC prioritization, again, you can try and deploy to understand which of these recommendations you should go with. And then similarly, 1, 2, 3, all of these different prioritization tools and scoping would actually help you come up with recommendations in terms of which ones to do first and which ones to do next, and what should be the priority in terms of first and next and last. So very important for you to have that sense of prioritization, because you're recommending, you're giving some set of recommendations. So they would obviously expect the BA and the persons working the SMEs to also give them prescriptive ways of defining when to do what. They don't want just a laundry list of things, but they expect a bit of guidance and some hand holding there, which is what the prioritization would help. And the process analysis is about identifying, again, the kind of bottlenecks, the breakdown scenarios, the workarounds, and coming up with steps and ways and means to try and optimize your processes to improve the output for each of this process. And then the surveys or questionnaires, as we discussed before, are a great tool. Again, in terms of quantitative data to gather the high level feedback about your product, not necessarily the detailed, deeper level experience driven feedback, but more like views. What do they think about this as an overall perspective? You can get that dipstick feedback from the people on that. So that's again another set of technique. So all these techniques would actually help us to get to the to the aspect of how we can try and improve the process, improve the existing solution, to help understand the gaps and bridge those gaps. So again, this is just a kind of a way of representation of how we can we can achieve this, pretty much what we have just set out for in a figurative way. Different decision analysis here, there's a gap here. What kind of things that you would need to discover the needs properly, and then be able to prepare to take the jump, to take that set of steps and the recommendations to implement what we wanted to do. And then this is the prioritization, the must-haves and the must-dos, and set the expectations, have a budget, get approval by the sponsors. And then once we have done that, we need to identify what is the potential value, and then be able to implement that, come up with the recommendations, and make sure that the recommendations are implemented in terms of technology, the operational aspects, and then the structures